Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're diving into something pretty important. The cost of reducing water pollution in Vietnam's seafood processing industry.
Yeah, this is a big one, and it's not just some, theoretical problem. It actually directly affects how governments can help push for cleaner production.
That's for sure. And the thing is, right, Vietnam's seafood industry is a huge part of their economy, like 3.7% of their whole GDP,
Wow.
millions of jobs. But it also means a lot of wastewater. So we really need to figure this out.
Absolutely.
Our main source for today is this academic paper, and they did a deep dive into what's called marginal abatement costs, or MCs. Basically, it's the cost for these seafood companies to reduce their pollution.
Right, and what's really interesting is they found that those costs can vary a lot from company to company, which is kind of a problem because right now Vietnam uses the same environmental fee for all seafood
It's
processors.
like one size fits all.
Yeah.
But if it costs some companies way more to clean up than others, that doesn't seem very fair there.
Right. It does raise questions about fairness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Imagine if everyone had to pay the same amount to make their cars, meet emission standards. Someone driving a fuel-efficient car already would be like, hold on.
Yeah. Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Okay, so what makes these costs so different then?
Well, they found a few key things. One is how much they're already polluting, what they call pollutant intensity. You might think the more a company pollutes, the pricier it is to clean up, but that's not always true.
Wait, really? Why is that?
It's kind of like when you clean a really messy room, right? At first, it's easy to make a big difference. You just grab the biggest, most obvious stuff. But then, it gets harder to find and deal with whatever mess is left.
Right, I get it. So what else?
Another thing is the kind of tech they're using. Companies with more, machinery and automation tend to have lower MDAs than those that are more labor intensive.
Huh. Is that because the machines are just better at, cleaning up the wastewater or?
Could be that those systems are more efficient, yeah. Or maybe they've already invested in cleaner tech from the get-go. But this finding has, big implications for policy.
Definitely. If a flat fee hurts the smaller businesses more, especially in a place like Vietnam where they provide so many jobs, that's a real problem.
Exactly. And get this, there's also a location factor. Companies on the coast or a river actually had higher MZs.
Oh, wow. I would have thought being near water would make it easier to discharge treated wastewater. Why is that?
It's not totally clear from the study, but it might be that those locations have less space, for certain treatment solutions. Or maybe there are stricter rules in those areas because they're more ecologically sensitive.
So location matters too. It's all connected.
Yeah.
What else did the study find?
Well, they also looked at whether companies mainly sell stuff domestically or if they're focused on exports. And you can probably guess.
Hold on, let me guess. Export companies probably have lower costs because they already have to meet international standards, right?
You got it. At least for some types of pollutants. Seems like they've already made those upfront investments. But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
They found that some certifications, like ISO or BRC, those standards for quality actually made reducing pollution more expensive in some cases.
Really? I thought those were supposed to promote good practices. How could that be worse for the environment?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, right? It might be that those specific certifications add extra steps or requirements that, while good for quality control, might actually increase pollution in some ways.
So it's not that those certifications are bad, but they might have these unintended consequences that policymakers need to be aware of.
Exactly. And to make it even more complex, other certifications, those focusing on things like sourcing raw materials sustainably, actually made pollution reduction cheaper.
Wow. Okay, so it's not so simple. It all depends on the details.
Right. And that brings us to another factor. Outsourcing.
Outsourcing.
Oh.
You mean like hiring another company to deal with their wastewater?
Yep. And they found that those companies had lower MAs for some pollutants.
So let me see if I understand this. If a seafood company in Vietnam is already polluting a lot, has all the fancy equipment, exports their stuff, and outsources some of their treatment, they might find it pretty cheap to reduce pollution even more. But a smaller, more hands-on operation located right on a river and dealing with certain certifications could get hit with much higher costs for doing the same thing. Did I get that right?
Spot on. You've really grasped the key points here. And this brings us back to that big question for policymakers. What's the best way to regulate pollution in an industry like this, where the costs of cleaning up are all over the place?
Right. If one size fits all isn't the answer, what are the options?
Well, the study suggests a system that's more flexible, like what's called a tradable permit system.
A tradable permit system. I think I've heard of that for like carbon emissions. How would that work for water pollution?
Well, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how that works, but the basic idea is that instead of setting a fixed fee for everyone, you create a market where companies can buy and sell allowances to pollute.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm definitely curious to learn more about that, especially if it can actually address these cost differences we've been talking about.
Yeah, we'll definitely explore some real-world examples of that and whether it could work. Okay, so let's say the government sets a limit, a cap on the total amount of pollution allowed from all the seafood processing plants. We'll call it like 100 units of pollution.
Okay, 100 units total.
Mhm.
But how does that actually work with all the different companies?
So the government issues permits, each one representing like 1 unit of pollution. And these permits, they can be given out to the companies, maybe based on their past pollution or how much they produce, or the government could auction them off, whoever pays the most gets them.
So if a company has a permit, they can basically pollute up to that amount.
Right. But here's the key part, the trading. If a company can reduce their pollution below their permit amount, they can actually sell their extra permits to another company that's having trouble meeting their limit.
Ah, I see. So there's an incentive to clean up. Because if they can do it cheaply, they could actually make money by selling those permits.
Exactly. It pushes everyone to innovate and be more efficient because those who can reduce pollution the cheapest, they'll do it and they can profit. And at the same time, the overall pollution stays under that cap, so it protects the environment.
But wouldn't that just mean the companies with the most money can pollute more? Like, couldn't they just buy up all the permits?
That's a good question. But remember, the total pollution is still limited, right? The permits just decide who gets to pollute within that limit. And since there's only so many permits, the price will go up if more companies want to buy them. So it gets more and more expensive for the big polluters, making them think twice about just buying their way out.
So it's like supply and demand, but for pollution. It pushes the market toward cleaner solutions over time. But how do you actually know if companies are following the rules? Like, isn't it hard to keep track of exactly how much each company is polluting?
Yeah, that's really important. You need good monitoring for this to work. So things like, regular reports, independent audits, inspections on site. And then would be penalties too, big fines if they go over their limit.
Seems like a lot of pieces to manage. Has this kind of thing ever worked before, in the real world?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The classic example is the cap and trade program in the U.S. for sulfur dioxide, which causes acid rain. It's actually been really successful.
So it worked for air pollution in the U.S.
Yep. By setting that cap and letting companies trade permits, they really cut down on sulfur dioxide. Air quality got better and acid rain decreased.
That's good to hear. But we've been talking about Vietnam and seafood. Are there any examples of this being used for water pollution specifically?
It's not quite as common for water as for air, but there are some interesting cases. Australia, for example, has been using a system of water rights and trading for a while now, mostly to deal with water shortages.
So instead of trading permits to pollute, they're trading the right to use a certain amount of water.
Right. The focus is a bit different. It's about how much water they can use, not necessarily pollution. But the idea is similar. Create a market to encourage people to use resources wisely. And there are some programs popping up in other places like the US and China that are specifically aimed at reducing pollution in rivers and lakes.
Sounds like this market-based approach has some real potential.
It does. But like any policy, you got to look at the good and the bad, right? One tricky thing is making sure those permits are given out fairly at the beginning so you don't end up hurting certain areas or types of companies. And you have to make sure the whole system is transparent, people can see what's going on and that the monitoring and enforcement are solid and actually working.
So it's not a magic bullet, but it's definitely something policymakers should think about, especially in industries like this with so many different kinds of companies.
I think so. And this study on Vietnam's seafood industry really drives home the point that we can't just have these one-size-fits-all policies. We need to look at all these different factors and come up with solutions that are adaptable and fair, especially when the costs of reducing pollution can vary so much from one company to the next.
This has been super informative. I'm really starting to see how understanding the economics of it all can lead to better policies that actually work and are fair to everyone.
Absolutely. And that's why research like this is so important. It helps us dig deeper and move beyond those simple assumptions and really grapple with the challenges of making sure the economy can grow while still protecting the environment.
So where do we go from here? What can our listeners take away from this, whether they work in policy or are just concerned citizens?
That's a great question, and one we should definitely explore further.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway for me is that you can't just set rules about the environment without thinking about how it affects businesses, the economics of it all.
I agree with that. And this look at Vietnam's seafood industry really shows that, right? We saw how so many things can change the cost of reducing pollution, like the tech there. They use their location, even those certifications.
Right, and if you don't consider those differences, you could end up with policies that don't work or that hurt certain businesses and maybe even slow down the whole economy.
Exactly. And that's why this idea of tradable permit systems is so interesting, right? It's more flexible, it could make things fairer, and get companies to figure out the best ways to reduce their impact on the environment, the most cost-effective ways.
So instead of punishing everyone the same, you reward the ones who can clean up better. It's like making being green good for business too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Of course, we talked about how there are challenges too, right?
Yeah.
You got to make sure you set the right limits and that the permits are given out fairly and
Yeah.
that you have a good system to monitor everything and make sure companies are following the rules.
Right. It's not perfect,
Yeah,
but it's definitely something worth considering, especially in industries like this where you have so many different types of companies.
for sure. And this isn't just about Vietnam, right? These are global issues. As we try to grow economies and keep the planet healthy, we need to understand these market-based solutions more and more.
So for our listeners out there, whether you're working on policy or just, trying to be a good consumer, what's the main message you want them to take away from this?
I'd say it's don't oversimplify things. Environmental problems, they're not black and white. We need solutions that take everything into account, the economics, the technology, and the social side of things too.
Well said. This deep dive has given me a lot to think about, and hopefully our listeners too. It's a good reminder that to find solutions that last we got to understand both the science and the economics of it all.
Definitely. And we need to be able to talk honestly about the costs and benefits of different approaches. That's the only way we'll come up with solutions that work for the environment and the economy.
Thanks for being with us for this deep dive. It's been a great conversation, and I hope everyone listening got a lot out of it.
It was my pleasure. These are important topics, and it's always good to have these discussions.